Dear friends, having looked at certain aspects of evidence-based surgery, critical appraisal of a paper and journal clubs and things like that, we change gears a little bit to look at what research is and how it differs from an audit. If you look at the challenges of practice of surgery across the world in the recent few years, you find three or four trends which are of significance. One of them, as we have mentioned, is the demand for evidence-based surgery. The world has really become flat. There is more health tourism, and you get patients from across the world, and if you're active on the net, you get asked about opinions from patients across the world. There is more consumer activism in society, so their expectations are more, and if you do not meet those expectations, then you will have serious consequences in a consumer court. Patient really is the boss in the whole process of healthcare, and he demands autonomy, and it is our duty to give him autonomy. And concepts which were unknown about 30 years ago, concepts like informed consent, patient confidentiality, and the necessity for thorough documentation. All these things have come as recent changes and challenges in surgery. As surgeons, how do we face this? Is now the hot question. The answer is that we have to be accountable. We have to be transparent, which means that you share everything that you know with the patient. You prove that what you're saying is scientific and state of the art and is in concordance with the most recent scientific knowledge. And you are accountable. You are accountable for your actions and your statements. And all these can be met only if you have an audit, a basic research mentality, and another more recent concept called service evaluation. We will not go into this, but it is, as an aside, I should tell you that you also have to be computer savvy if you want to fit all these things in your daily practice. Let's look at research for a bit. Doing research must be ingrained in all of us. And if you look at what the qualities of a researcher or a scientist are, I think what hits the high or the most important thing about the researcher or the scientist is integrity. I think he should be very, very honest and transparent. He must be inquisitive. He must have the questioning attitude, questioning in the right sense. And he must also be innovative. I honestly believe that intelligence and ingenuity are probably at the bottom of the list. Now, if you're looking at a research project, you basically ask a research question. For that, you need to have a problem. Okay, we'll take a simple example of, say, putting a Ryle's tube after a cholecystectomy. Now, we keep doing it all the time. No, really, the answer is, the question is, do we need to put it in? So think about it, and you'll probably think that really it's not necessary. The incidence of ileus, gastric ileus, soon after a simple operation like cholecystectomy, particularly laparoscopic cholecystectomy, should be very low. And so you ask yourself a question, is the Ryle's tube necessary after a cholecystectomy? Then you go to the literature, look at it and see what is already written about it. And if you find that you have the answers already, then perhaps your question is already answered and you'll have to look at some other problem. But if you don't have the answers, then you ask the question, have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis should be that a cholecystectomy, a Ryle's tube is not required after a cholecystectomy. write a protocol to check whether you can answer with your good study this hypothesis in the positive or the negative. If necessary, seek collaboration with all your colleagues so that you can have more cases. Funding may not be very important in this project. Collect and analyze the data, interpret it, draw conclusions, and answer the question. And that is your body of work. And once you have that answer, when you have put the whole thing together, you present a paper in a conference and then submit it to a good journal for publication. And once it gets very popular, once it becomes normal practice, then you apply the knowledge. Now, this is the standard so-called research cycle, and it applies to every research question that you have. The situation with medication, which is also a very common um, research question that you ask, is a little different. The clinical trials, particularly of drugs, go through several phases. Unlike a simple act of putting or not putting a Rayleigh tube or using a hand anastomosis versus a stapler anastomosis, drugs go through several more phases. And I think it's good that we should all be familiar with it. Some of you may be familiar. For those of you who are not familiar, this is a simple explanation of the various stages of a clinical trial involving drugs. For a surgeon, this becomes important in the context of antibiotics and in the context of chemotherapeutic agents in cancer treatment. The first phase is a preclinical phase where a given compound is tested on animals and in the laboratory. The purpose is mostly to look at its safety and activity. The first phase is a clinical phase where 20 to 100 normal people without any disease are chosen and this medication is given to them, and the purpose is only for safety. These people, remember, have no disease, but you need to prove that it is safe in humans. So this phase 1 is basically to establish safety. Phase 2, with 100 to 300 patients, the medication is given to look at its effectivity. It could be a chemotherapeutic drug or an antihypertensive drug or an anticoagulant or whatever. So you study it in a small number of patients and say whether it is effective, and at the same time you look at the toxicity of that medication. The next phase is the most important phase. You use the drug in a large number of patients, thousands of patients. Then you have the study to look at its effectivity and long-term effects. Only after a drug is proven to be useful in a phase 3 trial, only then can it come for regular clinical use. And before it gets on to regular clinical use, you have to have approval from the concerned authorities. In India, it is the drug controller, and in America, it is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Phase 4 is a post-marketing study. It is also important. We all know the classical example of thalidomide, which gave rise to a lot of congenital abnormalities, an antiemetic drug. It had gone through these phases, and it had passed the tests of the authorities, and still you ended up having a big problem after it was used. So post-marketing is something that we should not ignore. The simple truth is that for you to get a compound from the beginning preclinical phase to the clinical application as a viable drug, it takes about 9 years. And if you start with 5,000 compounds, you'll end up with one possible proven medication. So you can see that it's a long drawn out and a very costly affair to have a drug trial. Now, when you're doing any trial, I think it's very important that you get a consent from the patient. So this becomes important when you're drawing up a protocol. I brought it up here because most of us take the process of consent from our patients very lightly. It should not be so. In a consent, you have to explain very clearly, even though it is time consuming. Very clearly, you have to tell them the purpose of the trial, how a given person is selected, say in a randomization, what are the methods involved, what is the kind of monitoring that we are doing, and we have to look at the end points, we have to explain what the end points are. And very important, without assigning any reason, every patient participating in a trial must be told that he has the power to opt out and discontinue at any time. And if there are any conflicts of interest, that has to be communicated upfront, straight away. When you are talking about clinical application, every single trial result that you see cannot be automatically brought into clinical practice. One very important thing is that it must be the result from a completed phase 3 study. Even to this day, we have problems, particularly in cancer chemotherapy. Many times after phase 2 studies are being brought into clinical practice, and that is honestly not the accepted thing to do. You must evaluate the endpoints critically. We have said enough about it. You must think about overall survival, quality of life, and things like that. And you must look at the adverse reactions and also the costs involved. There's something new, and if its benefit is only marginal, but it perhaps is an extremely expensive medication, then you must think twice before you use it. Today, the hot area where this should be applied is the use of monoclonal antibodies. Imagine you will have to spend a lakh a month for that, and if you have an increase in overall survival of 3 to 4 months, what is the advantage of giving it? That's the kind of question you must ask before you clinically apply what the trial says. Now, an audit is slightly different from a research, and let us look at how it differs from research. An audit generally has no question. It doesn't ask any question. But what it does is a critical analysis of the quality of care that we are giving, and it compares what you are doing with explicit criteria or recognized standards. And then you look at how well you compare with it, whether you're as good as what others are doing or what the recommendation is. If you are not good, you improve yourself. If you're better, or as good or better than what the set standards are, and perhaps you don't have to do anything else. The aim is to identify ways of improving and maintaining quality. That's the primary aim. It assists in continuing education so that you are familiar with protocols for doing everything. As simple a thing as starting an intravenous fluid, taking a consent, writing an operation notes, putting a urinary catheter. You must have a standard practice. It's called SOP, a standard operating procedure for everything that we do, and the whole team must follow. So if you have an audit and if you find that people are not following the SOP or standard operating procedure, you should educate them so that they conform to the SOP, and to help make the most resources available for the provision of surgical service, the most of resources. We're all in a cash crunch, and so if you are looking at some practice which is wasteful, an audit will throw it up, and you can then improve the practice so that the same effectivity is obtained with lesser cost. There is an audit spiral very similar to a research cycle, but you understand that there is no question here. It's a little different. You select a topic, let us say starting an intravenous cannula. You agree on standards of best practice. Several professional bodies tell you that. You define the methodology of how you collect information. Get a pilot, look at how people, nurses and residents are starting IV cannulae, analyze the data and you report it. And if you find deficiencies, you make recommendations. You implement the change, and then 6 months later, a year later, you re-audit And so each time you do this, it keeps on going better and better each year, every 2 years perhaps. You keep doing an audit. And that's why it's called an audit spiral rather than a cycle. Audits are of three kinds. It can be a structure audit, it could be a process audit, or an outcome audit. It depends on what you're measuring or what your uh, audit is about. If you have a structure audit, it has to do with the way you have designed your hospital, or you have structured your process of, like, shifting a patient to the operation theatre or discharging a patient. If some patients complain that it takes a very long time to discharge, then you do an audit of various phases involved in a discharge of a patient, and you'll come up with an answer as to where the delay is, and you may be able to institute processes to improve it. The process is like doing any of the normal day-to-day ward activities that we do, putting an IV cannula, as I said earlier, urinary catheterization and things like that. Outcome is very straightforward. You look at recurrence rates of a hernia or wound infection rates after a laparotomy and things like that. And if you look at those aspects of your practice, that becomes an outcome audit. So in summary, research has a hypothesis. It has a research question. Audit has no hypothesis. It just measures performance against set standards. You have methods to test the hypothesis in research. Here you have methods of checking what you are doing against the standards. Results prove or disprove a hypothesis. Here there is nothing to prove or disprove. It just tells you whether you are keeping with the world standards or whether you're not. If you're not, you propose improvements to meet the standards that are required. In summary, research and audit are an integral part of our life. Doing surgery without applying either of these, audit or research findings, is really no longer acceptable. And these are required to make us complete surgeons. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of module 6.